Give me 1 second. Here we go.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, so let's get right into the topic. So today I want to talk about three things. One is the context of the war, just to give a bit of background. Obviously, that part alone could take hours and hours, but we'll try to condense. But then I want to talk about dialogue in Ukraine, how it's been applied as a peace building practice, but also some of the different dilemmas and issues that have come along with it, and how people have engaged with, overcome, or maybe not overcome so far, and then where we are now with how things stand. Because at the moment there are different levels of talks that may result in a ceasefire, and but it's very complex and very fragile at the moment. So hopefully we'll have time for all three of those. So first, just as a general question for the audience, when did the war start? If someone can just give me a number, give me a year.
Okay. Most of them are saying 2022, Josh.
This is what a lot of people tend to say, but the war. A lot of my Ukrainian colleagues say that the war actually started in 2014. So the full-scale invasion of Russia into Ukraine started in 2022, but to look at the roots, we have to go back a bit more than 10 years. So from 2013 to 2014, there was a protest movement that was called Maidan. Maidan is the word for city square, and it resulted in a revolution. So the former president, his name is Yanukovych. He was pretty pro-Russian in the picture there, looking very pretty. He was ousted by the Maidan Revolution. Obviously, the issues go further back, much further back than this, but this was kind of the spark that led to the revolution and the formation of a new government that was decided to be more pro-Western rather than pro-Russian. And in response to the revolution, there were a number of things that happened. So first, there is a. Can you guys see my cursor when I move it, or no?
Not moving it? Yes, we can. Yes.
Perfect. So here is a map of Ukraine and a little bit of Russia, because Russia is huge. This is the Black Sea. Wait, no. This is the Black Sea, and here is a peninsula called Crimea. And so soon after the revolution, Russian soldiers that were kind of in disguise came to the peninsula and basically declared independence, and then declared that it was joining Russia. So it was fully annexed, and Russia considers Crimea Russian territory now. So this happened in early 2014. And at the same time, in the east part of Ukraine, these are two regions called Donetsk and Luhansk. There was violence actually in different parts over East Ukraine, but it resulted in two sections of these regions becoming basically de facto independent from the control of Kiev. And these have been framed as separatist areas, but there were the participation of Russian soldiers also in the violence. So from 2014 to 2022, there was not as much violence as there was in this original 2014 to 2015 phase, but basically Russian soldiers came into these separatist areas and beat the Ukrainian army back, and basically kind of pressured them to signing agreements called the Minsk agreements. And so all of these well-dressed-ish politicians here are the folks that basically collaborated on creating and signing the Minsk agreements, and created basically a new status quo. So this Crimea was still controlled by Russia, and the separatist parts of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts were still basically not under the control of Kiev. And this was the status quo that basically lasted from 2014 to 2022. And the Minsk agreements also included a negotiation element where there was an attempt to try to resolve the issue, but obviously it was not successful. And there were two Minsk agreements, the first and the second. And obviously this is kind of getting a bit into the details, but it's important for what we want to talk about today. So there were different components. So for example, one is a ceasefire, but there were lots of disputes between like Ukraine and Russia between this. So for example, whenever you have some kind of peace agreement that have different components, you have something called sequencing. So you have to think about, okay, so what component is going to come before what else, right? So ceasefire often comes first, but some people want some kind of guarantees before a ceasefire happens. One big problem that led to the non that led to the Minsk agreements not being implemented was this basically there was no agreement on what order the different components had to be uh, implemented in. So, for example, elections in the occupied areas were supposed to happen, but also the restoration of border control to Ukraine was supposed to happen. But Russia wanted the elections to happen beforehand so that they could basically kind of, because the separatist areas were in the control of Russia, they wanted elections to happen first so they could put in people that they could influence, and Ukraine wanted the border to be restored first. So these different elements, basically, because nobody could agree on what had to come first, the agreement was largely unimplemented. Another big issue was that there was disagreement between who were the actual parties. So for Ukraine, here there's a term called NGCA, which means non-government controlled areas. So Ukraine saw the NGCA, the occupied territories, as being controlled by Russia, and so they said, "Oh, this is a war between Ukraine and Russia, so Ukraine and Russia need to be at the table, and Russia has to be considered a party to the conflict." Whereas Russia said, no, 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 it's a civil war. It's Kiev, the capital city of Ukraine, versus the occupied territories. Russia isn't a party to the conflict, they're a mediator. So there was even a disagreement on who the actual parties of the conflict were, with Russia trying to force Ukraine to sign an agreement with the separatist parties, and Ukraine trying to force Russia to admit that it was a party to the conflict. So there were all of these different discrepancies in this negotiation process, and there's obviously these are things that make it very difficult for a peace process to move forward. There's a term in peace building called constructive ambiguity, which means that you don't need to define everything, and you hope that over time de-escalation and pragmatism might lead to creating some breakthrough. But this ambiguity with sequencing not being defined and with the parties not being defined and a number of other issues that weren't being defined basically led to this 8-year period between 2014 and 2022 as being kind of frozen space where the conflict wasn't resolved, and there weren't really many steps that were taken forward. So this is about like it's not just this is a warning about it isn't just about getting people around the table and starting to talk, but if you don't have a well-designed peace process, then um, the conflict isn't going to be resolved and things aren't going to go anywhere. So and this is something that people are worried about right now, because if the peace process right now is not going to be well defined, then there's a risk that it's just going to be like a Minsk number 3 that's going to fall apart again in another couple of years. So looking at the mistakes of the past is important in trying to figure out why the agreements didn't hold and why we ended up with a whole new phase of the war. And when that phase of the war came, the full-scale invasion is what the Ukrainians call it. So you can see here on the map that the brown areas were ones that were under the control of Russia before 2020. Before 2022. The red and the green were areas that Russia took since the beginning of the war, but the green are areas that Ukraine was able to take back. So Russia is only holding on to about half of the territory that it took, but it's still quite a large portion. And eventually, I forget the date, but the Russian government declared that these parts of Ukraine are now officially parts of Russia, and not just the parts that are under occupation, but you can see there are these little bits of the regions that aren't under Russian control, but Russia still says that they belong to Russia. So it's quite tense. But after the initial year where the contact line moved, hasn't been much actually. There hasn't been much movement. And this is what's basically called a war of attrition, where like thousands and thousands and thousands of people are dying, but the line isn't moving very much, and so there's a question of what can be done to try to de-escalate this. And now 2025, we obviously have some new players to the game, and Trump's election basically, like, on the one hand, is destabilizing the world order as it stands, and there's a lot of issues with that. It also means that there is space to try to think about, like, what's because Trump is trying to pressure Ukraine into making some kind of deal, and he's promised that if Russia doesn't agree, then he's going to pressure Russia as well. So he is trying to use strength to force the two sides into signing some kind of peace agreement. But as we'll see later, this is a little more complex than people would hope it to be. So this is like the basic context of the conflict as it stands right now. And so it's like, okay, so there's war, there's like mediation, there's negotiation, but what role does dialogue play in all of this? So I want to talk about dialogue in the period before the start of the invasion and after the start of the full-scale invasion. So who was doing dialogue, what was possible, what were the results, what were some of the issues that were that kind of emerged because of that. So first, going back to 2014, when there was this Maidan revolution, the takeover of Crimea, and the violence in Donbass, there was basically a lot of concern about trying to, well, since there wasn't movement in the official negotiation process, people were like, okay, like, are there other kinds of peace building mechanisms that we can use to try to create space and movement elsewhere? And one of those is dialogue, which I'm sure you've been talking about a lot over this event. So the main thing is that a lot of the dialogues were initially initiated by foreigners, so foreign organizations, folks like Ottawa Dialogue. Ottawa Dialogue doesn't work there so much, but like other organizations have worked in East Europe, and so they were trying to initiate dialogues in Ukraine. The OSCE is one organization that's like Europe-wide that also includes Russia, that was also trying to initiate different dialogues. So there was a lot of money that was coming into different initiatives at this point. And it was really chaotic because there wasn't a lot of coordination between them. It was just like, oh, you want to do dialogue? We're just going to give you some money. Obviously, not as simple as that, but there were a lot of organizations that normally did humanitarian aid or worked with women's shelters. And because there was such a push for dialogue, they started thinking, okay, maybe we can start doing dialogues within our communities. Eventually, over time, there was a lot more coordination. There was a community of dialogue practitioners that was starting to meet each other, often at the events and conferences of these foreigners. And through there was developed informal networks of practitioners. Eventually, over time, these local practitioners started to run dialogues themselves. And instead of being like employed by foreign organizations to facilitate their dialogues, they were the ones that were designing and coming up with dialogues and asking for foreign funding to implement it. But obviously there were issues with this. So first, again, like when everything is so donor directed, it means that if the donor is focusing on women's issues, then a lot of the dialogues are going to be focused on that. So if you're focusing on veterans, which in Ukraine are mostly male, there you might be incentivized to work with women's communities, which is still really important. But it kind of creates a bit of instability if you're working with veterans one year, then women's groups another year, and then maybe the eastern part of the country for another year. So this can create issues. Also, right now, there's a big collapse in the humanitarian industry because of Trump and different things that he's doing with that USAID. So a lot of organizations now are getting their funding cut, and so it's when you're dependent on outside sources, like, this can be a source of instability. A second point is what some of my colleagues call dialogue pop-ups. So again, somebody saying, "Oh, we're going to host a dialogue," and it's just like a one-time event, and it's not connected to any other kinds of stuff, and it can be a really good conversation among the participants, but it might not lead anywhere else. It might not coordinate with others. It might not think, okay, so what's already been done? Maybe we can innovate a bit. Maybe not. Then there's this term called grant eaters, which is basically people who just chase the grants and chase the donor money, and That's kind of their focus is more on getting the grant money and earning money rather than actually trying to make an impact in the community. Another issue was there were so many different definitions of dialogue. That some people were using dialogue to resolve conflicts. Some people were using dialogue to basically just describe like a panel discussion or an expert presentation, like right now. So there had to also be there. I know that in 2016 or 2018 there was like different Ukrainian practitioners created a document about okay, so there are many different definitions of dialogue that are out there, but these are the definitions that we use. And so when we say facilitated dialogue, this is precisely what we mean. So that was also a stage that they had. Another issue is that practitioners are not professionalized. You can't like people don't go to school to become a facilitator. Usually, there might be some programs right now, but a lot of people are actually trained professionally as lawyers, as social workers, as researchers, like sociologists. Some people might be come from a religious background. They might be part of the clergy, but they also facilitate dialogues. And so on the one hand, it's great because anybody can start their own process, but on the other hand, without professionalization, there's a lot of inconsistency. So some people might do dialogue one way, and then if somebody else facilitates a dialogue, it might be like another way, and this can like that can be cool, but it can also cause problems. But also with any peace building so basically like you can think of peace building initiatives as eating healthy, right? Like you eat healthy every day, or like you work out a little bit every day, and you might not see the results for a long time. Like there is growth, but you don't see this like this sexy change that everybody wants to see immediately, right? So there is, or if you design a dialogue thinking I want it to have this kind of impact, and it doesn't have that impact, it's easy to think that it was a failure. But maybe there was a different kind of impact. So, for example, a lot of the dialogues didn't resolve um, the conflict overnight. But those dialogues created networks, they created communities of people, they created conversation, they created like they also when you're in a dialogue for more than one time, oftentimes it also trains you to communicate differently. So if you're doing a dialogue with journalists or with religious leaders, and if you're having this dialogue regularly for a long time, then maybe this is going to help them like act differently in their context. So there are also different types of dialogue. So most of them were inside of Ukraine. So between, for example, displaced people and their host communities, dialogues between involving veterans and their communities to help them reintegrate because they've been traumatized. There's also like decentralization. So they wanted to like create more power to go to the regions rather than to stay in the capital. Then like there were dialogues inside of the government about issues like transitional justice, how to reintegrate occupied territories. There was a minority of cross-contact line, which means dialogue between Ukrainians in government-controlled territories and Ukrainians in non-government-controlled territories or with Russians. So this might be on a political level, it might be like a regional level, so like two towns on different sides of the contact line. It could also be religious. Religious dialogues were particularly popular, especially if there was the same religion. Um, and eventually, after time, this kind of there was a community that was kind of developed out of this that tried to connect some of these different facilitators called the Ukrainian Community of Dialogue Practitioners, which allowed them to be like to kind of continue coordinating. They had their own conferences. Then also there was this collective reflection about okay, so what's worked, what hasn't worked, and why, and having some kind of space to talk about that and to work on those questions together was important. There are also like communities of mediators. There's also communities of I don't know. I know that I can't remember them now, but there's like a regional community of mediators. There's also like lawyer related, like mediation and facilitation. I don't remember all these things right now, but there's like different groups. But this is one group that I've worked with that I can speak to. So they formed this community, and then there was the full scale invasion in 2022. And so if you're working for 8 years on dialogue, trying to make sure that an invasion doesn't happen, and then it happens, like this is pretty awful, right? This is not what you want to see. And so instead, like if you're a facilitator who's also a Ukrainian, you're going to be wanting thinking about right away, like how do you get safe? How do you get your loved ones safe? And then also like what does dialogue even mean now when the violence is not only back, but it's worse than what it's ever been. And so I want to talk to you about some of the responses that they had and some of the things that they were doing. I don't want to say that this is the right answer in all situations, and it's if we had more time, it would be really great for discussion. But I want to talk about this as a case. So these are um, this is what how the community of dialogue practitioners responded to the invasion. So first, they had to really process that like years of work were destroyed. Um, the trust that a lot of people had built, especially if it's a cross contact line, maybe that trust is still there. But if there are spaces that are now occupied by like an army, maybe people are feel too afraid to engage in dialogue again. People are afraid to be discovered by the army. Lots of stuff that can happen. But at the same time, even across the contact line, both inside of Ukraine, but also in Ukraine and Russia, like people who engaged in dialogue for years and years before, they were now a network of people that could be mobilized to do stuff. So, for example, humanitarian aid. There were a lot of Ukrainians that, when the Russians came into the like a new area, a lot of Ukrainians were deported into Russia, including children. So like people inside of Russia could coordinate with Ukrainians that they had dialogue with before to try to find those children, to try to like find like a safe way to bring them back to Ukraine or to get them to leave Russia. Um, there was like coordination between people who tried to create humanitarian corridors when the violence is bad. So these are like this is something that was a surprise that when something really bad happened, like the participants of those dialogues were able to coordinate even if they didn't necessarily believe all the same thing. But at the same time, they had to ask themselves what does dialogue mean when there are guns and when getting people together into a meeting of like 15 to 20 people might not stop bombs from falling. So this also led to the question of like who should have dialogue with whom right now and for what reason. So again, there was a shift in their attention. So they wanted to focus on their own kind of like processing their own traumas, so like self care and recovery, and having that be a part of their like rhythm of practice. Especially at the beginning, because there was a lot of burnout, there was a lot of fear, there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of uncertainty. And then there is the initial issue of addressing displacement. So lots of people inside Ukraine were displaced to other parts, and inside those towns where people came, there's a lot of tensions because people in the east of Ukraine, a lot of them speak Russian, for example, and so when they come to a part of Ukraine that speaks Ukrainian mostly, sometimes there were tensions between the displaced people and the locals. And so this is also a site where you can do dialogue to help integrate and lower tensions. You can also do dialogue between organizations that are coordinating like humanitarian like aid. They also helped a lot with refugees and evacuation, and they also wanted to set time to actually reflect about what's next. And so this reflection, they came together like through this organization, but they also invited different international like colleagues, experts, and allies, and they created a group to kind of reflect on like what does dialogue mean in like during the hot phase of the war. And I was very happy and honored to have been able to participate in that. And obviously we don't have time, but I could speak a lot about what that experience was like. But the um, the community basically also created a statement. Um, they created like different kinds of content, but the most kind of influential one at the beginning was a statement called the 7 points on the war and dialogue. And they basically were saying, okay, so this was their request to international peace builders to say if they take local ownership seriously, these are things that they want them to consider. And you might not agree with all of these points, and that's also okay. I just want to tell you like what was their ask for the international community. So they wanted to clearly declare the invasion as an act of aggression. So it's not like two parties that are like equals that are coming to the table, but like one person is an aggressor and one person is a defender. And they say that any dialogue process that involves both Ukrainians and Russians has to acknowledge that, because they were saying that one part of the Minsk agreements that didn't work in the past was that they tried to treat them like equals when one side had much more power. And one side was a defender and was like trying to fight for survival, and the other side was not. And so this creates different pressures, and that if you want to have a meaningful dialogue process, you have to like take that into account. Two, track one dialogue. I don't know if you guys have talked about like track one, track two, track three, but this is basically like dialogue on the highest level, so like Putin and Zelensky, like Trump and Biden or whatever, right? They say that this is necessary to so dialogue that will support things like grain deals, prisoner exchanges, ceasefires. Like this is really important because it like alleviates suffering. But they say that tracks 2 and 3, which are kind of like uh, influential leaders, but also like on the community level, they found that these were problematic if they're between Russians and Ukrainians, because it's like what's the it depends on what the point is right now. So it's like if Ukrainians can influence their government, but Russians can't influence their government, what's the point of speaking to those Russians, right? Or if the Russians who want to talk with them are already anti-war, then also like, is there a point to having anti-war Russians and Ukrainians having a dialogue? Like, what impact could that have on the conflict? And this was another really big thing because like a lot of people do dialogue for the sake of dialogue. Like any dialogue is good. Let's just start somewhere. But there's some people that design a dialogue to have a particular impact. And the Ukrainians in this community were like, why, like, what impact can it have right now? And if there's not going to have like a good impact, then is this wasting resources? And is this possibly going to like re-traumatize Ukrainians in that? So it's and also there is there was a risk of Russia saying that like or like the Russian government saying that um, like we want dialogue, but you don't want dialogue. Why don't you want a dialogue with us? Like, oh, they don't want dialogue, and so they want the war to continue, and so there's this like weaponizing of the discourse of peace and of the discourse of dialogue. That's another huge issue that we can't really get into right now. But they said number 4 is a dialogue can be used in other ways. So, for example, inside Ukraine, to help with humanitarian coordination, to help with displaced persons, but also between Ukraine and its partners. So, like dialogue between like Ukraine and Europe, or like different European countries, or dialogue between Ukrainian refugees and locals in the European countries where they've been, or like dialogue between activists. Like, for example, there could be like dialogue with like Russian activists who are helping with like human like evacuation of adults and children from Russia. Like those are areas that are possible. They said that they support the anti-war Belarusians and the Russians, but they say that the dialogue isn't appropriate. Next, they say that there has to be a certain amount of local ownership, so like nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. And they say that if you want to do dialogue in Ukraine, hire local experts, involve them, don't sideline this experience. So this is what they said in their statement, and it caused a lot of discussion. So again, their biggest asks were to central like to center Ukrainian peace building practitioners and to listen to them. But also, they were saying that armed defense is legitimate when somebody is attacking you, and they were saying it's okay to work with dialogue, but also want to arm the army, like to give weapons and stuff. That's another huge conversation that we could have about can violent and nonviolent means of resistance and conflict resolution work together, but also to acknowledge the asymmetries. So, like again, Russia and Ukraine aren't like there's like one is more powerful than the other, and so they say that that maybe it's good to strengthen Ukraine's position in order to have more of a dialogue of equals. So there was a lot of resistance to this or some resistance to this in the international peace building community along different lines. So, for example, some were saying, okay, so we're hearing that we need to listen to Ukrainian voices, but whose Ukrainian voices? Like, are the voices that create statements like this, are they representative of people? Are they representative of the kind of middle class NGO sphere? Would the people who are on frontline in frontline areas say the same, or maybe they want to end the war faster than people who are further away from the front line? So there was some resistance to this in that sense. There's also resistance in terms of militarization. Some people say that pacifism is the only good way to go, and so arming Ukraine to fight Russia was a bad thing, and that dialogue facilitators should only be pacifists. There were some that were talking about pragmatism, and so it's like, like we don't want a European war, we don't want nuclear war, and so we want to avoid escalation, and so it's better not to make Russia too angry, or it's better, like, yeah, Ukraine is weaker, but we have to accept that. And there's others who say that who also kind of challenge the Ukrainian, this particular Ukrainian community, saying that maybe psychologically they're too close to the situation. May maybe they need to kind of take a step back or trust internationals who can think with cooler heads about this. And so these are all things that I've heard in from international peace builders that I know, colleagues that I've worked with, and also just people that I've been in contact with. Um, and some of them were saying that these are reasons to ignore things like the statement or other statements of like the Ukrainian like community, and to say like let's just try to create peace as soon as possible. But then it's like, what is peace? So there's a huge kind of conversation around this. There was a big summit, the International Summit for Peace in Ukraine, that was in Vienna. That was more like this kind of critical of the Ukrainian peace builder side, and there's like a whole story of like sabotage. People are trying to sabotage this conference. It doesn't really matter, but it's just like it's there. If you want, you can read about it. So basically, there's this like conflict between peace builders about how best to approach peace in Ukraine, and that also weakens the ability to actually like do something. So if peace builders and dialogue facilitators are spending a lot of time fighting amongst themselves, they're doing less to actually try to address the conflict. And so where are we right now? What are some of the dilemmas and issues that continue to be relevant? So I see that I only have 7 minutes left. Maybe we'll have time for a question or two. Maybe not. We shall see. But right now, we're seeing the return of strongman politics. So we have like folks like Trump who are trying to basically like create a deal and to like pressure people into accepting a peace. But again, this goes back to this issue with the Minsk agreements that were in 2015. They were also forced on Ukraine, and they didn't really work. You know, they didn't really solve the problem. They just kind of froze it for a while. There's also challenges to the liberal peace building system. The liberal peace building system, it like tries to include different voices. It goes a bit slower. It tries to, or at least it says it tries to do things like with more focus on democracy and human rights. But there's also a return of authoritarian conflict management that just says, okay, let's just go in there, like do some bad things, but then we solve the conflict. So, for example, with Armenia and Azerbaijan, which is another post-Soviet conflict, Azerbaijan just sent their army to like destroy a separatist area, and now there's no problem, right? So this is something that's becoming more popular. So alternatives to the liberal model. Also, and I'm speaking from you like a more Ukrainian perspective right now. Ukraine's concern is that there's no trust in Russia. In 1991, Russia said that it would respect Ukraine's borders. It signed a document called the Budapest Memorandum, and they basically like broke that agreement in 2014, and then again in 2022. They are afraid of imposition of like being forced into a peace agreement, and they say that it might not be legitimate. It would just be like a third Minsk. They're also saying that if there's no security guarantee, how can we actually believe anything? And the last one is, or it's not the last one, but just like one thing that's the last thing we're going to talk about here is in the previous peace agreement process that started in 2014, 2015, they used constructive ambiguity, which is like we're not going to define the order of things, we're not going to define who the parties are, and in hope that over time we can find a creative way forward. And they're like, no, that caused the issues last time. So if there's going to be an agreement, let everything be concrete. There's also these issues like what's the relationship between justice and peace? What's more important, that Russia is held accountable to the war crimes, for example, that the soldiers committed, or for the invasion, or is it more important that the fighting just stops as soon as possible? And what's the balance between that? And I'm sure that you've seen different versions of this dilemma in your own home contexts. Um, yeah, and then there's like all sorts of other issues, like again, like diversity inside Ukraine. Like, what about the men? Maybe like there's a lot of men who don't want to fight. So what if there's no men who don't want to fight? Should they be forced? Should they not be forced? What does this mean if there's no army? Like, there's lots of conversations about this. There's also this issue of decoloniality. Like, Ukraine wants to basically like get rid of the influence of Russia, but they're also using nationalism to do that. And there's some forms of nationalism that are also destructive, that are being used in this kind of fight against Russia. And so there's this tension between this. There's also the issue of Western dominance, right? Like, is there an issue that the West is becoming like more and more like controlling of Ukraine? So, for example, Donald Trump is trying to get them to sign this deal over rare earths and minerals. in return for aid that was already given. So there's lots of different dilemmas that continue to remain. And so again, the three main spaces for dialogue they've identified is like inside Ukraine, between Ukraine internationals, and across the contact line. But how do you design dialogues that can address like these different issues and these different dilemmas? This is especially right now when world leaders have basically said, okay, we're going to decide what's going to happen, and you're just going to have to agree. Or there's that kind of energy that's happening right now. To the extent, like to what extent Ukraine and Russia will be able to negotiate directly, to what extent America is going to control that process, like should Europe be part of this? So there's lots of different issues. So dialogue at the moment inside of Ukraine can help mitigate the impact of war. So help people survive, get people out, create networks of people who are able to do like humanitarian aid. People who support Ukraine might also use dialogue to improve Ukraine's position. So if there's like somebody who's like not really sure if they're pro-Ukraine or like anti-Ukraine, they might use dialogue to try to like push for their views. But also there might be dialogue that will help explore possible concessions and compromises. So for example, there's lots of different opinion polls about like what compromises Ukrainians may want to make in order to stop the violence right now. And dialogue can also play a role in trying to identify like where spaces for compromise might be. With internationals, like I said, like with partners, among peace builders, or between Ukrainian refugees and host countries. But with dialogue across the contact line, this is still like a huge question. Like, what is possible right now? What's the point? Do we think that it might change something, or is it dialogue for the sake of dialogue? With whom? Would it be with the Russian opposition? Would it be with pro-war Russians? And so, but even if something doesn't feel possible or likely right now, maybe something that is possible to do is to build infrastructure for future dialogues. So like training Russian dialogue facilitators, or building networks so that even if there's no dialogue, it makes dialogue easier to happen when it's time and when it's appropriate. So that is it for me. And I have 1 minute left for one question.
We'll stop the video and we'll open the